So, my friends, thank you so much for coming to your International Institute for Strategic Studies today to hear a friend of this institution and a friend of mine, the great Stan Sloan, talk about his new book. For those of you who don't already know Stan, he was a national intelligence officer for Europe. He had a long and very productive career at the Congressional Research Service, helping the American Congress understand alliances. There has never been a textbook, to my knowledge, about NATO issues, right? NATO publishes their fact book, which is boring, but important. There has never been a textbook because there's actually never been the need for a textbook, because Stan Sloan in the early 1980s that you wrote Toward a New Transatlantic Bargain?
That was the first version of it, yes, mid-1980s.
Because Stan's book on the transatlantic bargain was the textbook that all of us used when we needed to understand the alliance. And he is now he teaches at Middlebury College, and he is a fellow in the Scowcroft Center for Strategic Studies at the Atlantic Council in Washington. And he is here today to talk to us about his new book. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to see you again. It's been a while. And also be back here at the IISS. I have a little story. The last time that I was here, I was headed for a conference at Wilton Park. And on the flight on the way over, I was looking at the schedule of the conference, and I didn't think I had anything in terms of a presentation to do early in the conference. And looking at it on the plane, I realized I'm supposed to give a presentation on the first day. So I dropped my bags in the hotel room, came over to IISS and used the library.
Yay!
Prepared some speaking notes and went and did it. But that was
excellent. You are the model IISS member, my friend, making use of the resources of this institution in order to do great work.
Exactly. So the only difference today was the complication was the taxi getting through Trafalgar Square, which took a little bit of time, but he still got me here on time, but then his credit card machine didn't work. So there's always something, right? But I'm really happy to be here today to talk a little bit about my book, and I will talk for a little while, but I'm really interested in hearing your questions and comments. That's the first priority for me, is to get the feedback. But obviously, you need to know a little bit about the project in order for you to ask me questions. The book has just come out recently. First, I'll tell you a little bit about the inception of the book. It started a year ago, believe it or not. My book on Defense of the West, which is the latest version of that 1980s book, Defense of the West, just been published by Manchester University Press. And I was talking to my editor in March of last year about when we should think about doing a revised edition, particularly because of Trump. And it's fairly logical. That edition did not have any serious discussion of Trump, because he really, by the time we closed that text, he was just starting to disrupt, which is, I guess, what we know that he's been doing. In any case, he said, well, my editor, Tony Mason at Manchester, said, well, we're going to have to talk about that, but the first thing I'd like to ask you to do is to consider doing something for our Pocket Politics series. And so, in effect, what I did for the Pocket Politics series was to address the issues that I thought needed to be addressed beyond Defense of the West. And so it became, in a sense, an extension or continuation of the discussion of Defense of the West. And in fact, I have a subheading in Defense of the West called Transatlantic Traumas, and that's obviously the head title for this small book. I like to say it's a small book because it is, Pocket Politics is rather small. The topics are huge, and a couple of the reviewers, anonymous reviewers of the proposal, wondered if I could manage to do the topic in that short a space. Well, in June of last year, we'd gotten through the process of the anonymous reviewers saying, yes, go ahead and do it, should be published. And 3 of my students that had been in my class on Euro-Atlantic relations the previous January volunteered to serve as my research assistants. And I must say that was an incredibly productive operation because very bright students at Middlebury College are very bright. I've been teaching there for 14 years now in their winter term. I'm not on the faculty. Each year I apply, each year they accept me and say, yes, we want you to teach again. So I actually had more than 3 volunteers, but I knew that I could only handle about 3. That was the maximum in the time and the substance. And I got 3 very bright young people who started out as research assistants and then contributed some text and became real collaborators in the project because they contributed ideas as well. Well, sometimes if you read the book, you may see that I, from time to time, say we, and I'm not using a royal we, I'm using a we on my research assistants because I wanted to honor the fact that they made very important contributions. By the time we got a text done, I was wondering if perhaps it shouldn't be called Liberal Democracy for Dummies, because in a sense, part of what the book does is talk about liberal democracy and how important it is. And this is the first time that I really have gone beyond what I've tried to do in my other books on European security, and that is to be as objective and nonpartisan as I can be, because that is how I grew up professionally. At the CIA, I had to be objective and nonpartisan. At the Congressional Research Service, the rules were very much the same, although you could go beyond the waters inside the water's edge, and obviously talk about the domestic side and foreign policy side of issues, whereas at the CIA you were only analyzing the foreign situation and not U.S. policy. When I got started on the book, I realized the first thing I had to do was to define what I meant by the West. And this ended up, I think, being a very important part of what I did in the book, and that is to make a distinction between my definition of the West and some other definitions of the West. I started out with the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty, because I think that is the core definition of the West. Sometimes people think about the preamble of the treaties being throwaway. I think if we look at current developments, we can see it's much less of a throwaway than it ever was, because those values are important: democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And in the book, I expanded a little bit to include tolerance and to include equality under the rule of law. But that is my definition of what the West stands for. And I argue that the 2 key institutions of the West based on those values are NATO and the European Union. And I also argue that those are the 2 institutions that are in danger as a result of the current tendencies toward illiberalism in Europe and in the United States. Now, the one distinction I make between my definition and other definitions is that of President Trump. When President Trump was in Poland last year, he put out a definition of the West. And his definition was, quote, the bonds of culture, faith, and tradition that make us who we are. And I argue that those definitions, or those aspects, actually tend to divide rather than unite people. And the ones that I have laid out, which have been laid out before and which we take for granted in many ways, are the ones that have the potential for uniting people, because people from any different cultural background, set of religious beliefs, so forth, can fall in behind the definitions of values that I've included in my book and that basically come from the North Atlantic Treaty. So that's the definition, very simply, and that I start out with in the book. The next question is, what's threatening the West? And my answer to that is that there are 2 primary threats. One comes from Russia, and the other comes from the Islamic State. And I know it's a little bit counterintuitive to think about these 2 sources of threat together, but if you think about it, they aim at very much the same thing. They aim at disrupting the Western system. They aim at undermining the faith of Americans and Europeans in their democracy. They do it in different ways. The Islamic State and Islamist terrorism in general aimed at disrupting the West and creating uncertainty. And in the longer run, if you look at their writings and their proclamations, they feel that Western civilization is a threat to their belief system, the way that they interpret Islam, and therefore they want to stop that Western system from intruding on their beliefs and their lives. Now, how much of that rationale is provided as justification for otherwise criminal activity is another question. But the fact is that the Islamic State and Islamist terrorism in general has been destabilizing by pushing the refugees from North Africa and the Middle East toward Europe, and therefore causing huge problems for the democracies all over Europe. That, in addition to the terrorist threat, which has changed the lives of all of us. We all live different lives now, particularly when we travel, because of the threat of terrorism. And so that is, to my mind, how the Islamic State has been attempting to destabilize what we know as the West. Russia, I think it's pretty clear that one of President Putin's objectives is to basically make the case that Western domination of the international system is not legitimate. And he has other ideas about how the international system should be conducted, should be run, should be structured. Most of his perspectives seem to include Russia having a much larger part in saying how the European security system should be structured and run, and how the international system more generally should be run. And therefore, the threat that he has posed is seen very clearly in a lot of ways. We're still finding out more about how he has meddled in American elections, and probably still is continuing to meddle in American elections. The digging process in the United States and perhaps in European countries is still underway. But I think from what we can see, what's been excavated so far from their interference in our elections, we can see that it was substantial, that didn't aim just at influencing voting machines, which it may have or may not have, but it had a big attempt at trying to influence the way that voters thought about the election and the way that they thought about what should be the desirable outcome of the election. And whether in the end Mr. Mueller finds out that the Trump campaign was colluding with the Russians or not, the fact is the Russians were trying to influence the campaign, and the intelligence community in the United States, which I believe in their conclusions very strongly, they say that they were trying to, once Mr. Trump became the nominee, that they very clearly were trying to promote his victory. Those are the two main threats that I see, the challenges, and they are similar because of the fact that they both seek to upset Western democracies and undermine popular faith in the democratic systems that we all believe in. So what about illiberalism? One of the things I argue is that these external threats are combining with illiberal tendencies in Western countries, and in a sense feeding on each other. So many of the illiberal politicians in the West think very highly of Mr. Putin, including apparently President Trump. So we have this interaction between the threats and the domestic illiberalism. It's funny, that term illiberalism, I was invited to write an article for a publication that I won't mention, but when their young editor got back to me with comments, some of them were very good and pushing me to do things and other things, but she said that I'm afraid the term illiberalism doesn't work very well because it raises the level, the reading level of the piece way above what we are aiming for. We're aiming actually for a high school level, 16-year-old level reader. And if you use the word illiberalism, it pushes up to college level. Well, I said, I'm sorry, but it's part of the title of the book, so it's hard for me to write about the book without including that term and that concept. So I took my article elsewhere, in the Atlantic Council of the United States published it as basically a summary of the main themes in the book. Some of you may be aware of the fact that Cas Mudde, the Dutch political scientist, done very excellent work on studying illiberal political parties around Europe. And we, in our research and writing in the chapter that we do, we picked up on his definition of the populist radical right as being the term that we would use also, that he had developed to describe a lot of what was going on on the illiberal side of politics. Another interesting point is that when I developed my concept, which I'll get to at the end of this talk, called radical centrist populism, I had a couple of and I broke it out on Twitter, and I had a couple of European political scientists who complained that you can't use populism that way. You can't use the term that way. I blame Kaz Mudd for being the cause of that, because he's developed it so strongly as a word that is used for the right wing. I happen to know, however, that in the United States we have right-wing populists and we have left-wing populists. One of them ran for president in 2016, Bernie Sanders. And I know because I actually did the work on European security for his campaign and wrote what his contributions to those issues for the Democratic Party platform. Even though I don't agree with Bernie on everything, he's the senator from my state. I love the fact that he calls out issues and calls out questions that other politicians do not. My main motivation when I was invited to work for his campaign, I didn't go out looking for it, I was asked if I would do that. My main motivation was to ensure that in spite of his somewhat isolationist tendencies in foreign policy, that his policies that in his campaign on European security came out more centrist, more to my liking. And it never came out in public because, in fact, Bernie Sanders never gave a speech on foreign policy in the whole campaign. And so all the work that I did was, I won't say I was for naught. I wrote an article that was intended for him to publish, and the campaign held it, and they wanted to wait until he'd given a speech. Finally, they said, well, maybe you should publish it. So I submitted it, and in the credit line, I said that I was working as the advisor on European security to Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders. And the campaign came back and said, well, the fact is that we probably shouldn't even say that. So the article just came out under my name, which is fine because it was everything that I believed in terms of where European security could go. Okay, that's a little side story, but in any case, the book covers the illiberal tendencies in Europe. It covers Turkey and the issue of Turkey and Turkey's drift away from Western values. It covers Brexit and the role that that plays and the illiberal tendencies. And then it covers what we call the Trump tsunami in the United States. And then it goes on to try to ask whether there are ways of dealing with the issues created by illiberalism on both sides of the Atlantic and the threats to this Western system and Western values and Western institutions. In that assessment, the book points out that in many ways we have this problem because liberal democracies and centrist left and right political parties have failed to respond effectively to some of the real needs of the people. There is a cause, a reason for populism defined in the dictionary definition, not in the it must be far right definition. There are issues that gave rise to these politicians and parties that took those issues and then used them in ways that were very self-serving, that played on the fears of people and then tried to enhance the fears of people, whether it was the fear of refugees in Europe, even in countries that don't even have many refugees, as we see in Hungary, for example, and Poland, for example. We see the fear of refugees being played on. In the United States, candidate Trump played on fears of terrorism and the fear that terrorism was being caused by immigration policies. And so he's brought that into the presidency. But I've always, in the early 1990s, after George H.W. Bush came out with the concept of a New World Order that Brent Scowcroft apparently had developed for him, I wrote a report for the Congress, and one of the things that I said was, these are great ideas. The problem is that fear is a much stronger motivator than hope. And that concept of his required a lot of hope. And unfortunately, fear is a much more powerful way of bringing people together behind a cause. And in any case, the fact is that, to my mind, those who believe in liberal democracy need to start by looking at those issues that have given rise to the strength of illiberal political movements and start to work on those issues more effectively. And that's why, in the end, what I come up with, and here's where I truly divert from my usual objective and nonpartisanship, although you might find my chapter on Trump not being totally objective, because I have some very strong feelings, which I think you will see show through in that chapter. But in the end, I do make a policy suggestion, and this is one that, say, where the young European political scientists had some objections, because I call for radical, centrist populism. And I argue it should be both principled and pragmatic. Principled in that it still needs to be based on the values that I use as the definition of the West. Pragmatic because it has to be responsive to the real concerns of people, of individual citizens. And it has to try to make the institutions of the West, the European Union and NATO and governments in general, more responsive to individual people, and perhaps change the perception, which is that they are largely dominated in one way or another by corporations and by the wealthy. So that is the heart of the suggestion. I'm talking about the need to rebuild the political center. In different countries, that can start in different ways. Every country has some parties that are either center-left or center-right. In the United States, I'm basically arguing that the base has to be established, or the approach has to be established in the Democratic Party, and then attracting in independents and moderate Republicans. And it doesn't have to be by people necessarily switching parties. It has to be with a new sense of reaching compromises, making compromise into a positive word, not a dirty word, which it seems to have become in recent years. And so I have not only defined the problem as being the relationship between external threats and internal illiberalism, but I've also tried to provide a political approach to dealing with it. I don't think it's a silver bullet. It's politics, so things aren't going to happen easily with any one formula, one political party, one political leader. But if we can start shifting attitudes toward the importance of the center, and this, although I don't get into this in the book, it has direct implications for the Democratic Party in the United States and where the Democratic Party goes in the coming elections. The Democratic Party goes out to the left in opposition to Trump, it's going to be not nearly as successful as it will be if it tries to attract the center and bringing on board Republicans who are opposed to Mr. Trump, who think that he is a dangerous president, who believe that he doesn't represent the Republican Party in any true way, at least the values of the Republican Party. In the long run, I would like to see the United States get back to the days we're always going to have political competition. Democracies are based on that political competition. But I'd like to see us get back to the days, and I was working for the Congress in some days, some years, when in fact Republicans and Democrats did work together. They'd fight, and they'd fight, and they'd fight, and then they'd compromise and produce some kind of outcome. And we've gotten away from that. And I think in the United States we need to get back to it, and that is one of the most effective and required ways of responding to the transatlantic traumas that I described. So I'll stop with that and look forward to your comments and questions.
So you are in a room full of sharpshooters, but I am nonetheless going to take the prerogative of the chair to do two things. First, to tell people that we are on the record and that I trust you are going to honor the ethos of the IISS by asking tough questions and having an argument about it, because that's how all of us refine our ideas. And the second thing I want to do is push you a little bit, to ask a question that pushes you a little bit on what seemed to me an entirely reasonable and entirely implausible set of recommendations. And it seems to me that you need a theory of the case of why the politics that you advocate are not the politics our country's practicing. Because unless you can explain how we've gotten here, I don't see how that Elysian plane of compromise and cross-party politics comes into being. So how did we get here, and how do your proposals fix it?
Well, we got here in a lot of different ways, obviously. It wasn't any one way. Perhaps the most immediate way was the opposition to President Obama by the Republicans, in which they started out by saying our main objective during the Obama presidency is to ensure that he doesn't get anything done. And with that kind of a political attitude, you aren't going to get anything done, particularly since the Republicans controlled for most of his term the House and the Senate. And that, to my mind, was a critical mistake made by the Republican Party, which I think they are going to pay for dearly, because now, at least as long as President Trump is the head of the Republican Party, there will be Republicans who will vote for Democrats, as we saw in the recent by-election in Pennsylvania. There will be independents who no way will do anything that they feel will end up supporting the president. And so, in part, it's going to be very difficult to undo all of that. And I think that the Republican Party is key here. I think I've said the Democratic Party in the United States needs to not to go way to the left, but to try to establish the center. And the Republican Party, I think, needs to do more or less the same thing, but as a much greater challenge, because the unpredictability of President Trump is very difficult for the Republican Party to get back to its roots. I think it's going to take a real down period for the Republicans to reestablish themselves and come back after Trump. And I don't see it happening during the Trump presidency. I think, and you look at all of the Republicans that are jumping ship in the House in particular, and you can see that that's how they see things, that they're definitely going down. And so there's no question that it's a difficult challenge, no question.
But you do have a fundamentally partisan description of how our politics got this way, and it is ascribing onto Republicans the responsibility for that. Questions, my friends? Yes, please. Won't you please tell us your name, where you are?
Hi, my name's Ben. I'm from King's, the Department of War Studies, across the road. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think there's a lot of truth in that from my perspective. But as an academic, if I may, I think it's too broad. I think there's a lot of issues that come with a lot of the assertions that you're making. I particularly work on Russia and ISIS are very two good examples, but last week I was speaking with Professor Pape of Chicago, and he's spent the last 2 years doing strategic narratives on ISIS, and actually making that causal link between the narrative and the effect, if you assert that it's influential, is incredibly difficult. It takes a lot of work, a lot of graft, a lot of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. So, taking one assertion, Russia is undermining US democratic institutions through its information campaigns. The methodological question I have is, for example, how do you distinguish between the narratives which are coming out of Russia, which are directly meant to undermine US democratic institutions and individuals, as opposed to discourses and narratives which have that unintended consequence? So how do you distinguish that? And I would ask that question because you need to actually measure the threat level. And therefore, when you measure the threat level, you can say, well, X amount of narratives coming out of Russia are meant to be threatening to, our institutions, our people. Therefore, we need to take this action to deal with this amount of threat. I don't think you can quite do that with the sheer massive scale that you're working on.
This certainly may be true. I accept that criticism. And in fact, the book is intended. I should go back a little bit and say what the whole purpose of the Pocket Politics series is to discuss complex issues in a way that the average citizen, the non-expert, will be able to understand and deal with them. And so the mandate was to bring things up to a level of generalization that the average person would not be put off by. It was not written for an academic audience at all. And in fact, I guess I'm comfortable with this because I've never considered myself an academic. I've considered myself a policy analyst. That's what I've done my whole life. And that's not an excuse, but this was the assignment. When I was working in the CIA, my job was to describe foreign situations in ways that the average person, including Secretary of State and President and so forth, people who might not be experts in my area, would be able to understand what my assessment of the situation was. While I was working for the Congress, what I wrote was intended to provide information that was accessible for staffers and members, committees. And for the most part, you had to avoid getting too far into the weeds. Now, the weeds are critically important in the academic world. And so what I try to do is draw on those academic sources and be educated by them, and then translate the consequences, the results, the conclusions into something that the average person can understand. So your criticism is perfectly correct in that you have to make a distinction when you're digging into the weeds about these narratives. But the fact is that in writing for the audience that I'm supposed to be writing for in this book, there was no way that I could get into that sort of discussion. So it's a matter of audience in part.
I really like Ben's point that how you think about that attribution goes to the description of the problem. I think that's really important. And to your point, Stan, my sense is that part of the reason there is such a strong anti-elite, come on in, Ben, anti-elite sentiment in the U.S. at the moment is not that we academics have been talking in academic terms. It's that we academics have been inhospitable to unacademic conversations about it. And that's what I think your book is such an important contribution to.
Yeah, people do feel that they're being talked down to. There's no question about that.
Next up.
Adam Roberts from Oxford University. I very much appreciated your description of the problem, but there were things that obviously in a very short talk, and maybe in a very short book, you have to miss out on. And a couple occur to me as really standing out. One is, and both reflect badly, I have to say, on the United States. One is, and on the British government, the involvement in wars to sustain democracy in countries with no long tradition of democracy, and the terrible difficulties that they have run into from Vietnam on to recent times. Governments that habitually or repeatedly do that are obviously liable to run into criticism, or at least it may not be the main issue for opposition, but they lose some of their magic if they have shown themselves to be flawed. But the other issue that occurred to me as needing more emphasis is after the Cold War there was a tendency to treat all problems as if there was only one logical solution to liberal democracy and the like. And in particular that put Russia in an awkward position of being a sort of country that's supposed to receive Western advice, Western monitors and so on, and supposed to be grateful for being able to sit in the waiting room of NATO forever. But it's an insult to the sense of dignity of a country that has always deluded itself that it has something great to offer the world.
It's a nice way to put it.
It's no wonder that one gets this sort of angry response from Putin, and you people just don't understand. Because from a Russian point of view, it is a traumatic and difficult situation.
Those are two excellent questions. The first one, actually, we do try in the book to acknowledge the fact that the West and Western countries have made a lot of mistakes and have done a lot of things to totally inconsistent with the values that they say motivate them. So that is acknowledged in the book. So that includes colonialism, it includes Vietnam, it includes the whole range of activities by the United States and European countries that are not consistent with that. It also includes the fact that in NATO we've tolerated the presence of authoritarian regimes and for at least periods of time in Greece and Turkey and Portugal to begin with. So it was not, the values didn't always guide everything that was done by the alliance. And in fact, obviously, national interests come strongly into play. And in fact, I would say most analysts, historians even, who look at this history will look at the national interests rather than the values, and will tend to say, oh, the values are there, they're nice. What I'm saying is that, yeah, we have pursued national interests, the United States and European countries, and sometimes we have totally kicked the values to the side. But the fact is now values have become more important because the challenge is actually to those values and not just to our interests, but to both of them. As for Russia, this is always a difficult question. I've done a lot of thinking, work, and writing on this question and was very involved in working for the Congress and trying to explain things at the end of the Cold War. And the conclusion that I came to was, and this was in the early 1990s, was that Russia would go back through another authoritarian period. It was not ready, and what we saw, the Wild West that we saw in Russia in the 1990s, was something that the Russian people did not like. Most Russians found it to be way too disruptive, and their standard of life, except for the ones that were super rich, the oligarchs that were doing well, everyone else was not happy with the uncertainty that came with that situation. I happen to think President Putin came along at a time when he had the motivation to restore the more authoritarian style of government, and he has done that. And we can say, well, would it have worked out better had we been more welcoming and not try to suggest that, it's only our values that are acceptable and we're going to dominate the future, which we did say, there's no question about that. And that's what the former allies in the Warsaw Pact said as well. We want out of this. We want out of this control by Russia, and we don't want to go back to it. And so there were a lot of different pressures at work. I tend to think, though, most of what has happened in Russia has to do with President Putin's desire to consolidate control. I think he was right that was probably the only form of government that was going to work for Russia in the near term, but it was also very self-interested. And all of his talk about the threat from NATO, to my mind, was also self-serving. I think he knows that NATO doesn't pose a military threat to Russia because NATO, the way NATO is built, the way NATO make decisions, it's very difficult to get the NATO alliance to engage in any kind of aggression against anybody, and certainly including Russia. But I do think that Putin always saw NATO enlargement as a political threat to Russia, because here were Western models that were moving closer to Russia's borders. And that's what he found truly threatening, I think, was the political model that was very different from the model that he was installing in Russia. So it's very complex. I think it's an issue we have to continue to think about. But on the other hand, I don't think that means we should say, oh, poor Russia, we mistreated them, so therefore we have to be kind to them now. And I just don't think that works.
I too agree with the description, but it's the policy prescriptions that come out of it that I struggle with, because they would run so counter both to our values and to our interests. And I think that's why the ship goes on the rocks. Yes, next up.
I'm Mahmoud. I'm a member of the Institute and currently affiliated with the Institute of China Studies in Kuala Lumpur. Thanks for sharing your insights. My question is this. a series of 4 or 5 documents have come out of Washington recently: the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, Worldwide Threat Review, and the QDR. All place China either slightly ahead of Russia or with Russia as a source of most profound threats to American or United States national security. You don't seem to think that. What is your view of the Chinese threat, if you like, to the United States and the West more generally?
It's a great question. I'm not an expert on China. I've been there one time and met with Chinese officials and analysts, and I never thought I would actually do that, but I've had that engagement. And of course, as an analyst of international security, one has to have some perspectives on this. So I do have some perspectives. In some ways, I think the greatest danger that China poses is from the potential explosion of that country coming at some point when the political system becomes totally incompatible with the open system in the economy. And when that explosion comes, that would be difficult for the whole world. And it's a funny thing to say, here's a country that has a political system that we disagree with, that is illiberal, but I am more concerned about what happens when this formula that they've developed consciously, this is a formula for economic success, which allows a good bit of independent economic freedom inside the system. But at what point does that openness conflict with a very closed political system? So that is the main concern that I have about China. I think we have to deal with the issues that China may raise in terms of some direct military issues that they raise in their region. But in many ways, there's the possibility for cooperation between China and the United States and Western Europe. But there is a strategic side as well, and there is this concern about the eventual collapse or collision inside China.
Next up.
David Nordell, I'm from a cybersecurity think tank. First of all, as a comment on your introduction, I think that you were really talking about transpacific traumas rather than transatlantic ones. I'm not saying that your analysis is out of place or wrong, but I don't think you addressed the issues of the differences of opinion, of interests between the various partners in NATO.
Inside differences among members of the alliance.
Including differences, by the way, of the decision-making process, which have been brought up yet again in the last couple of days because of the attack on the Syrian chemical plants. Mm-hmm. My question is slightly different. NATO, and to a slightly different extent the European community, don't have apparently any kind of cogent strategy for dealing with the two threats that you talked about, Russia and the Islamic State. From the point of view of the tactics that they're actually employing against the West, which are basically cyber warfare and information warfare, and perhaps in the case of the Islamic State, I'd call it ideological warfare rather than purely information warfare. Yeah. The West doesn't seem to have its act together at all. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of coordination meetings and so on and so forth. Most nations are still doing their own thing.
Okay, so let's have him answer that.
How do you respond to this?
I respond that to some extent that's a natural state of affairs. The alliance has in many ways always been that way. There's never been complete agreement on, even when we had, during the Cold War, when we had strategies that were oriented largely toward defending against and deterring the Soviet Union, there still were a lot of differences inside the alliance. And the Allies found different ways of dealing with those differences. The Harmel formula was the most important of those, I believe, because it basically said we can do all these things. We can do defense, deterrence, and détente, and we can work together. And that was a way of accommodating the fact that there were such strong pressures, particularly in Germany, on the détente side, and perceptions in the United States and the United Kingdom that we still needed a very strong defense posture. I think we're still in that kind of a situation where we have these different national interests. No question, there's not a single one interest or even totally agreed strategy. The alliance has always required flexibility in order to accommodate these different perspectives and the different national interests that give rise to these perspectives. And I think part of what NATO is a constant process of accommodating these different interests and trying to find ways of cooperating together in spite of them, rather than saying, okay, we're all going to come to this great agreement. This is part of my philosophy of international relations and foreign policy, and that is that usually the challenge is to manage problems rather than to solve them. And this is an important thing to say to Americans, because we Americans tend to think that we can solve problems. And we have a history of believing. We have some history that tells us we're very good at that. We overcame all of the obstacles toward becoming a nation from our revolution on forward, and expanding from one sea to the other. And we did all these things. We came in and rescued Europe after World War I and World War II. So we've got a philosophy that says we can solve these problems. But I think it's very important for us to understand, particularly in the U.S., as I think more Europeans understand better than Americans do, that very often it's a question of managing them. And NATO is a very effective management tool.
So let me just add 2 points to that. The first is the most insightful comment I have ever heard anyone make about the NATO alliance was Stan Sloan circa about 1987, when he said that the 3 oldest refrains in the West are NATO's in crisis, we need new thinking, and deterrence is breaking down. Nothing's changed. But one important thing may be changing, and I think this goes to your concern, which is that the problems that we have successfully managed as an alliance have always been problems that allowed us the time to work our way through to consensus, to navigate around sharp areas, and to come up with an effective response. And the kinds of problems you work on may be collapsing that time envelope in a way that have the capacity to put an asymmetric set of strains on free societies and on alliances of free societies.
But there's one other point. Within NATO, there are 2 neighbouring countries that are already at blows. Greece and Turkey.
Let us come back to this if we get through the rest of the questions. We have several other people and only a few more minutes. Dr. Sharp.
No, I never did get that PhD.
What? Nobody here follow that example, please.
Jane, I'm sorry, I didn't even focus on you being back there. It's great.
I nearly put my Bernie Sanders t-shirt on. So you
Great to see you.
Thank you for not doing that for my behalf.
Stan and I go back a long time. We go back to the negotiations on the mutual and balanced force reductions treaty. So it's a contrast for us now to be in this world where we can't really talk to the Russians. Because in those days, we all had powers that we used to go back and forth. So when you lay out the threats to the West as Putin and the Islamic State, I don't know if this is in the book, but maybe you could reflect on it now a little bit. I mean, how much in the book is acknowledging the real big mistakes that we've made?
Acknowledging
the really big mistakes in terms of maintaining a good relationship with Moscow and indeed what we've done in terms of dealing with Islam. And I'm thinking the thing that really struck me coming out of this history of obstacle it was George W. Bush who started the collapse of all the Islamic agreements by withdrawing from the enemy. And that was a big mistake in terms of going. And I think if you look back to the start of ISIS, I don't know this field as well as I know Article, but I have heard many people who spent time on that problem saying that the dismantling of the Ba'ath Project was crucial to the beginning of ISIS, many of whom are all Ba'athist generals. So I just wondered how much of that is in the balance view when you're dealing with
The fact is, yeah.
Before you answer that, would somebody sitting in the back open one of those windows so we get a cross breeze? Even though we will have to talk louder, we are less likely to have people fainting dead away in the aisles. Okay, fire away.
On the Islamic State, absolutely no question about that. But the book does not get into that. It does not get back into how and who's to blame and whatever. But there's no question, to my mind, Bush administration totally blew it with their approach to after declaring victory in Iraq. And so, yeah, the United States caused the Islamic State to become a problem and an issue. There's no question in my mind about that, but I don't get into that because we have to deal with what we have now and the circumstance that we have now. I think we might disagree a little bit on Russia, because I think to some extent what happened in Russia was almost bound to happen, because I don't think the country was ready for any kind of a political approach internally other than that which Mr. Putin brought in. And one of the requirements to maintain his authoritarian form of government is to have external enemies. And so I think to some extent he has made his...
A very quick follow-up, because we have 3 more questions in 10 minutes.
To do enlargement?
To enlarge NATO.
Yes, I do. I don't think we had any choice, and that was my. I was working for members of Congress who were both opposed and those who were in favor. But my personal belief, and I actually wrote some things about this, was that NATO. There was no way that NATO could say no to these countries that said, yes, we'll do all these things. We'll establish democracies. We'll establish civilian control over the military. We'll do all the things that the Perry Principle said should do. And I don't think we.
So I'm going to take the last 3 questions and last 4 questions, and I'm going to ask folks to be telegraphic and brief. Please have a question, not a statement. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, my name's Connor. I'm a student at King's College London in War Studies.
Yay, I'm glad you're here.
To what extent do you think a lot of these problems can be solved by NATO-EU cooperation?
By NATO being?
NATO-EU cooperation. Excellent idea. Next up.
Hugh Salmon, LSE Ideas. Question about your radical centrist populism. Does it, if it were ever to work, necessarily entail an attempt to pull back from international integration, economic, political, ethnic?
Excellent question. All the way in the back. Sir, you. Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind then. I'm not giving you the chance if you didn't have your hand up. Yes.
Joseph Ratcliffe from KRA Group. You described the rise of the liberal forces within the West to insecurity and failure to address issues which resonated with the people. How would you describe the rise of illiberal forces outside of the West? In Asia, for example, is Xi Jinping, Duterte in the Philippines, Subianto in Indonesia, where these regions were seen superficially on the up?
Excellent question.
Okay, NATO-EU cooperation. I think that NATO-EU cooperation is very important for a whole lot of reasons, because if we don't have a good relationship between those 2 organizations as the key institutions of the West, then the West is very weak. And so that's always been part of the problem. When I wrote my first version of the book that Corey talked about, how the new transatlantic bargain, the idea of the end of that book was that we needed a more cohesive Europe in defense, and that would be the new transatlantic bargain between the United States and Europe. And so I've always believed that developing greater cooperation is important. What I don't think is helpful are things that go beyond reality. And to some extent, the aspirations that are expressed by some European politicians for Europe to become much more than I think it can be right now I think is unhelpful and tends to mislead American leaders. I think the Obama administration was far too optimistic about what Europe could do. And their approach to burden sharing was Europe needs to get more unified and be more united Europe. And I think that totally ignored all of the nationalist obstacles to that step, because some people who call for greater unity on the European side in defense don't realize that first it has to be political unity. You can't do it the other way around. It's going to be political unity, and then defense unity will flow out of that. Defense cooperation is another thing. And so the trick, to my mind, is being pragmatic, getting as much practical European level cooperation as you can get, and making sure that that remains consistent with transatlantic cooperation. In that case, it's a critical relationship and very important to the West that the two institutions work together. I'm not sure if I understood completely the radical centrist, the question about the radical centrist populism.
Well, briefly, one of the main reasons for illiberalism has been the disjunction between national political authority and legislation and the decreasing ability of national governments to deliver on all areas of policy because the world is now integrated. So if you're going to address that, do you actually try and make it less integrated, which Trump is at least talking about trying to do?
Yeah. Well, the main thing that I say in the book about that relates to that is that one of the problems that has led to the right-wing populism has been the feeling of distance between the individual citizen and democracy. And I think in the European Union, it is partly that European Union. A lot of average citizens in Europe think that Brussels is making decisions that do not take into account their preferred way of life, their history, their traditions, and that government has gotten so far away from them that this, I think, has separated them from support for liberal democracy, whereas a more illiberal approach seems to them to be responding to their needs more effectively. And that is one of the big problems that I say needs to be dealt with. In the United States, just instead of Brussels, say Washington. A lot of Americans feel the same way. If you want to get Americans upset, you just say, well, Washington's making us do that. And so in both cases, I think it's important for liberal Democrats, I mean small d, liberal Democrats, to try to reduce that space between, be more responsive to the individual citizen and their interests. And this may mean, implicitly in Europe, a little less unification on the European level, or at least a little bit less procedural and process and regulatory and those kinds of things that people see, why are you telling me how to make my cheese? I've been making my cheese. People and my family have been making my cheese for centuries, and you're going to tell me to change that? I think that kind of thing really undermines strength for the process of European integration and also undermines liberal democracy.
And is the effectiveness argument the answer to the question about the rise of illiberalism elsewhere?
The effectiveness of
You just said that people are looking for effective governance, and they don't feel it in a globalized environment, and they don't feel it in free societies. And so I was giving you a bridge to his good concluding question about the rise of illiberalism elsewhere, wondering whether
in
it was
other
the
regions. Yeah, I'm
effectiveness.
sorry. Apologize. I get caught up in one answer and forget about the other one. We didn't address the question of illiberalism elsewhere, but it obviously is a reality, and it would be and of course there are liberal democracies in Asia, and so the question is, will those liberal democracies be able to survive in an environment where they are not ultimately threatened by illiberal tendencies? There are countries that have very strong illiberal tendencies already, and we don't consider them part of the West at this point, do we? We consider Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. We're getting, that's pretty much it. But they are part of the West. And I acknowledge that in the book, but I say we're not really going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the challenges to the American and European democracies and how to respond to it, because I argue it and I believe that the transatlantic relationship is a key pillar of the international system. And if it weakens and falls or becomes less of a support for liberal democracy, I think we're in big trouble, not only in the transatlantic area, but internationally as well. And I think the Asian democracies feel an interest in that as well.
I feel like that's a perfect note to end this conversation on. My friends, thank you so much for showing up today. Your intellectual engagement on these issues is the lifeblood of this institution. So thank you for nourishing us all. Won't you join me in thanking Stan Sloan?